thank you for joining us today for webinar number 2 in our 6-part series. Again, today's subject is a very tough subject. It's proven to be stressful, it's traumatic, it's triggered a plethora of emotions and behaviors. And on today, we are in very capable hands with Dr. Frank Johnson, who is going to address this topic just the way it is. No sugarcoating it, because it is what it is, and it's supported by data. So a little bit about Dr. Frank Johnson. He is a licensed clinical social worker with a master's degree in public health and social work. He's got a doctorate in cultural anthropology, all from Temple University. He's got a certificate in cognitive behavioral therapy from Bryn Mawr College, Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research. He's also served as a preceptor, an instructor, similar to a mentor with medical students and residents from Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, from Harvard and George Washington Universities, as he works to coach them in the provision of patient-centered integrated care. He's an experienced healthcare professional. He's got diverse experience in strategic planning, clinical leadership in behavioral health, and federally qualified health center environments. He currently manages the integration of medical treatment in behavioral health settings. And so it is our pleasure and honor, as we have partnered with the Scattergood Foundation and Spectrum Health Services, both located here in Philadelphia. It is our pleasure on this morning to introduce to you Dr. Frank Johnson, who, so buckle up. Some of you get your box of tissues out. He's gonna touch you where you are. And so with that, Dr. Frank Johnson, take it away.
Hi, thank you, Marla. Quinn, am I good? Is there anything I need to click here, or just?
Let's, you can click on your share screen icon.
Okay, go to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we're ready?
There you go. Yep.
But now the moving forward, I have to go back to that, right? It kicked me out of, when you went to your screen, it kicked me out.
Okay. I would try escaping out of your slideshow mode. And then do the whole process again.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, and hit your share screen button again. Great, and then hit slideshow mode.
Okay.
Beautiful.
That's it? Okay.
Looking good.
So good morning, everyone. And Marla, again, thank you for that introduction. And, you know, it is a rough topic, and it's a rough topic in a rough year. 2020 is certainly a year that we will never forget, whether we want to or not. It will be very hard to get over. Not only are we in the worst health crisis of our lifetime, which has shed light on the interconnectedness of physical and mental health, but we are also confronting the realities of things that we have never been comfortable with acknowledging, and that is that racism is real, right? We've seen this throughout this year. It's not something that disappeared a while back. It's not something that disappeared when Barack Obama became president. It's real and it's with us. And one of the things that have come to the surface this year is that we're a country that's divided by race, and we're polarized by how we should best address it. It's something that needs to be addressed, and we're not all on the same page on how to address it. And that's the challenge. And hopefully with this webinar, we'll, you know, that we will have some food for thought and inspire some individual action toward making changes, at least at the individual level. So objectives today is to define the term racism and microaggression. These are two terms that get thrown around. different perspectives on it, but there's some definitive terms, definitive ways of describing it, and describe at least 3 ways that racism and microaggressions result in stress and trauma for its victims. We want to describe the various acute and chronic biological and psychological effects on individuals, because stress over time does affect our health. We want to describe 2 ways that diversity initiatives can have limited impact on addressing racism in the workplace. So as we all, some of us may be leaders and maybe hiring managers and charged with diversity in the workplace, a lot of times those efforts are not effective. And so we want to look at why it's not effective and some ways that it can be. And then identify 3 things participants can do to work toward anti-racism in their own lives. Okay. I want to go over 3 scenarios here first to get started, to kind of get us to start thinking. 2 are videos and 1 is an image. And as we're looking at these videos, they're brief. I want you to think about the interpersonal dynamics that you're seeing play out in these scenarios, the people involved and what those dynamics are. Okay, we'll start with this one, and feel free to raise your hand if you want to make a comment. This is meant to be interactive. Raise your hand, put something in the chat if you have a comment or a question. The chat room is going to be monitored, and I'll certainly address those questions.
A woman from St. Louis has now been fired from her job after a Facebook post goes viral. Thanks for joining us. I'm John Brown.
And I'm Sandy Miller. The post shows her trying to keep a man out of his own apartment building. Fox News' Andy Banker is here now with why she's been fired.
Her now former employer has issued a statement about her firing using the words racism and racial profiling. Friday night, Darian Tolles, a black man who lives here in the Elder Shirt Lofts building on 13th Street downtown, was trying to get inside of his building, and a woman blocked him. Repeatedly tried to keep him from getting to his apartment. She was white.
You're blocking me
into my building.
Okay, and it's my building as well, so I need you to get out my way.
Okay, what unit?
I don't need to say that information. So excuse me, ma'am.
I'm uncomfortable.
Okay, you can be uncomfortable. That's your discretion. If you're uncomfortable because of you, I need you to move out my way, please. Follow me all the way to my door.
As a plain.
And you see my keys in the door. As
a record, I just want to say hi.
Ma'am,
what is your name?
Ma'am, you just no. Have a good night, ma'am. Don't ever do that again. You look pretty stupid on video. Have a nice night. And my name is Mr. Tolles.
Tolles recorded the incident and posted the videos on Facebook, tagging Fox 2. In those videos, the woman repeatedly tells him no as she tries to block him from getting into the building and making his way to his apartment. Then she follows him down the hallway, up the elevator, right to his door.
People are sick, man. They just got to get that the system, and then I think it takes open dialogue, it takes open conversations. People need to get uncomfortable and grow.
The woman worked for the property management company Tribeca STL. This is not one of its buildings. The company issued a statement saying in part, the Tribeca STL family is a minority-owned company that consists of employees and residents from many racial backgrounds. We are proud of this fact and do not and never will stand for racism or racial profiling at our company. After a review of the matter, the employee has been terminated. Now, Tolles says about 30 minutes after the confrontation, police knocked on his door. Police confirm a call to this location, but say no report was written. We've tried to get a hold of the woman, but have been unsuccessful. We've been unable to reach her for comment. Tolles says he wishes her no ill will. As far as we know right now, both still live in the building. In downtown St. Louis, Andy Banker, Fox 2 News.
A woman from St. Louis has now been fired from her job after
a few days ago, we posted a story about a young lady by the name of Destiny Tompkins that worked at a Banana Republic in White Plains, New York. Now, she detailed on Facebook how she was treated by her white manager. And he told her that her braids was too urban and it looked unkept. And her image wasn't the right image for Banana Republic. So she shared that with the world, and it was shared many times. Now I want you to hear her actual take on this.
Old Destiny Tompkins has worked at this Banana Republic store at the Westchester Mall in White Plains for just about a month. She was called into a meeting with her manager on Wednesday, caught completely off guard by what happened next.
He was like, yeah, so the district manager came in. She pointed out something about your hair. And I'm like, okay, so what's wrong with my hair? He said, it's a little too urban and unkempt for our look and for our image. We were just wondering, like, if you could just take them out.
Destiny, who works to pay her way through school, says she could not believe it was her hairstyle coming under attack by her 30-something white male manager. She says she tried to explain to him that many black women choose this style to protect their hair from colder weather, but that did nothing to persuade him.
When I heard that, I was just like, you know, it's okay, because I was looking for a new job anyway, so I might just quit soon. He was like, oh, you can quit today if you want.
This Harlem native and aspiring filmmaker vented her anger on Facebook, generating plenty of reaction. She says she wants this manager to apologize, to be disciplined, and most importantly, to truly understand why she was offended by his comments about the braids she had just put in about a week ago.
It's basically like, you're just telling me I'm too black to work here, and you have a problem with the way I present myself as a black woman.
Banana Republic did release a statement today saying it is investigating the incident. Quote, we are committed to upholding an inclusive environment where our customers and our employees feel respected. Meantime, Destiny says she will soon quit the job and that she and her family are considering legal action. They believe this is clear-cut discrimination.
I felt so overwhelmed and confused, and I just felt like so powerless within that moment.
Before we start the commentary, I want to reach out.
Okay. So give me your thoughts. What dynamics do you see happening here? Any thoughts? In both videos, the interaction, the interpersonal dynamics.
Feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute your mic.
Any takers?
We have a raised hand from Samantha.
Okay, I can't see Samantha. Can Samantha?
Hi, Dr. Johnson, can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you. Thanks.
Great. So I'm Samantha with the Scattergood Foundation. Thanks so much for joining today and leading this important conversation. You know, I think this really highlights how long this has been happening and how many places in our country. And, you know, I think we see people's implicit biases becoming explicit as they acted on the things in their heads and their minds. And so we see two people who are targeted because of what people held as internal beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing we see here, Samantha and everyone, is that there's a power dynamic in both of these incidents. Right.
Very
so
much.
In the first one, the woman there, she felt empowered that she could stop this man who said he lived there from coming into the building. He had a key. She even followed him up on the elevator to his apartment to try to prevent him from entering. And she said, well, I don't feel comfortable. And his response was, well, you're uncomfortable because you're you. I thought that retort was interesting. You're uncomfortable because of you. And the police was called in that situation. In the second scenario here, her conclusion was very telling, and it fits into what we'll talk about later around diversity. And she says, basically, you're saying, I'm too black to work here. So the statement that comes from Banana Republic, and I have to tell you, I don't know if you've heard of these past incidents, but Banana Republic is notorious for these incidents happening with Black employees. It's been going on for decades. And so it's interesting, the statement, the disclaimer, well, we're committed to diversity. Well, that's arguable because these incidents happen at Banana Republic and have been going on for a very long time. So, you know, the public relations statement is that we're committed to diversity, but there's a level of disingenuousness around that. And, you know, we'll think about that a little later. what does it really mean to have diversity? Is it simply checking off a category on a box when someone is hired? What does that actually mean?
Dr. Johnson, we have 2 other raised hands in the room here.
Okay.
We have one from Isaac, and then I'm going to call in Kendall next.
Okay. Hi, I can't see you on my end. I can't see the hand, so.
Isaac, if you're there, can you unmute your mic?
Sorry, I don't think I raised my hand. Thanks though, Quinn.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Kendall.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I kind of missed the first video, but with the second video, it's always sort of like the person has blinders on, like they don't see what seems obvious and plain. So like the racism part is obvious and plain to some, but for the person that's inflicting or being racist, it's always like it's a blinder. It's like I don't get it. I don't get why you're upset. I don't get why you're asking these questions. Like I don't understand what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And the young lady, you know, her response on the other end was, I felt powerless. Right? She used the word, I felt powerless. And that's at the crux of really in defining what racism is all about. It is about power.
Out to our viewers and supporters to help us reach our 3,000.
Okay. So this image here, the third image we're going to look at. So by now, millions of people across the world, right, have seen this image. For many people, they've seen it repeatedly. This is a very, many people have found this to be a very disturbing image. And speaking of power, what do we see in this image? Right, this is the notorious George Floyd incident that happened back in the spring. We see someone in a position of power. We see someone who is powerless. Anything else that you notice in this video? Excuse me, in this image?
Okay, we have a raised hand from Marquita.
What was that?
We have a raised hand from Marquita. Marquita, go ahead and unmute your mic.
I would say that I see a lack of concern, a kind of a nonchalantness, if that's a word.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kendall, I
And
see your hand is raised.
Indifference.
I just wanted to add, I see a level of comfortability.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
His surroundings. It's just it's like he feels so comfortable with his knee on the guy's neck. It's okay. I'm doing nothing wrong. I'm okay. For example, if you're doing something wrong, you're not that comfortable knowing that it's wrong. Like for him, it's like I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just comfortable with doing what I'm doing, like it's almost justified that I can do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else? So we definitely see a level of indifference in terms of I would say almost like that there's indifference to the recognition of power, that this officer has power over this person's life. It's as Kendall mentioned, it's almost like this is second nature to him, that this is okay. It's not really power. This is just what I do. So while the George Floyd incident didn't involve shooting, A major impetus for social justice this year in 2020 have been protests around the country is due to the culmination of fatal fatalities that come from police shootings. And so here are some numbers over the past 5 years of fatal police shootings. And we pretty much say within, some numbers that it's really kind of consistent. And June 7th, June being the midpoint of the year, we pretty much were on track for what the pattern has been. So defining racism, there's 3 ways we can look at this. It's using power, and I want to emphasize the word power, is using power and privilege at the individual, community, cultural, and institutional levels to oppress culturally diverse people based on characteristics perceived as inferior. Using power and privilege to justify the enforcement of the dominant group's values. Using power and privilege to enforce conformity to the dominant group's cultural standards. And certainly with the young lady in Banana Republic, these three aspects we see in that incident, right? Her hairstyle was not of a particular cultural standard. And Banana Republic is basically saying you need to conform to the standard of beauty that we have here at Banana Republic, because otherwise it's problematic. Enforcing the dominant group's values. Oppressing culturally diverse people based on characteristics perceived as inferior. I would argue in the first video, the woman was essentially saying that you couldn't possibly live in this building. I don't believe you. You don't belong in this building. And I don't believe that you do live in this building. So a concept that's important, that kind of is a first cousin, if you will, to racism is implicit bias, because it's implicit bias that drives the acts of racism themselves and drives microaggressions, is implicit bias that peoples have. These are biases that live deep in our subconscious, and I have to emphasize subconscious because it's not something that we necessarily have an awareness of, and develop starting in childhood through exposure to direct and indirect messages. So it starts in childhood because it's in childhood where we first start to develop racial identities. Children aren't born with a sense of race. Children aren't born knowing that someone is white or someone is Black, right? In terms of childhood development, it's not until around the age of 8 years old, that children start to become aware of differences based on race. And some of that is due to the messages that they get from their parents, messages in the household, messages from the larger society starts to infuse those sense of differences in them. These biases shape our attitudes about other people based on race, ethnicity, age, and appearance. Implicit biases exist even if they don't align with our declared beliefs or reflect beliefs we would state in public. So on the surface, we may not see ourselves as being biased. We may not see ourselves as being prejudiced, but it's embedded, the bias is embedded in our subconscious, right? And it shapes things and decisions that we make around difference, if you will. The other word that goes along with our concept of racism is microaggressions. And this is a word that's been around for a while, but it's become pretty popular in recent years because racism kind of has an extreme connotation, and people reject the idea of causing harm, as they don't see themselves as being racist because they don't see themselves doing these extreme acts. And so microaggressions explains these not so extreme acts that still have damage to the person on the receiving end. And these are subtle, brief, and commonplace daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental offenses, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults toward people of color. Perpetrators of microaggressions are often unaware that they engage in such communications when they interact with people of color. And so there's three types. Micro insults are subtle actions that are rude and insensitive and are demeaning to a person's racial heritage. And so this plays itself out in comments like when a Black person's told, "You're a credit to your race," right? The speaker of that has good intentions of giving a compliment, but in many ways it's a backhanded compliment. Okay, "She's pretty for a Black woman. You speak so well." Getting undesirable seating in public accommodations. It's always, I always chuckle when I go to a restaurant and the host or hostess, be a room full of empty tables, and they'll decide that they want to seat me near the kitchen. Has that ever happened to anybody? And I'll ask, there's a room full of empty tables, why do I need to sit near the kitchen? And the response is kind of like, "Oh, okay, well, you can sit, you can sit wherever you want to sit." But the immediate thought was, I'm going to seat him near the kitchen. That's the implicit bias. The micro assault, deliberate disrespect characterized primarily by violent, nonverbal, or an environmental attack meant to harm the victim. So we see this now, these images across the country with rallies and promoting the Confederate flag, hanging of nooses in different scenarios. There have been noose hangings at universities, there have been noose hangings in workplaces, all in the sense of, it's a joke or just, kind of fooling around, making comments like, "Your kind of people just don't get it. You people you just don't get it." Micro-invalidations, actions or communication that excludes or negates the thoughts, feelings, and lived experiences of people of color. I don't see color. I'm not racist, I just don't see color. I just see people for who they are. All lives matter. Black lives matter shouldn't be uttered. Black lives matter doesn't matter because all lives matter. At a press conference that it was someone in the Trump administration had, one of the speakers, it was a woman, was talking about Aunt Jemima and said that Aunt Jemima is the picture of the American dream. Now, for many other people, Aunt Jemima is a throwback to slavery. It's a negative image, it's a stereotype, but she saw this, invalidated that, and lifted Aunt Jemima as being part of the American dream. What is the problem with the statement? And it seems, pretty innocuous, but what's the problem, do you think, for the person hearing, "I don't see color"? Any thoughts around that? The person who receives that message, "I don't see your color."
Michelle, what do you think? Unmute your mic there.
I think when you say you don't see color, that means you don't see me. Because when I walk in the room, the first thing you see is I'm a Black woman. And you don't see who I love. You don't see anything else about me but that I'm a Black woman. So I think you invalidate who I am at the core of who I am.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else? Well, Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter statements, those are pretty charged statements nowadays that, that trigger a lot of controversy and a lot of just emotions in people. people feel that somehow or another saying Black Lives Matter is invalidating everyone else. But why is there a need to say Black Lives Matter? Why would that be something that even came about? If all lives truly mattered, then why would there be a need?
We have a comment in the chat from Jeanette saying, discounting me as a person on color.
Yes.
I'm going to call on Savannah. Savannah, what do you think?
Hi.
Hi.
We have to say Black Lives Matter to assert that they do in a society where all of the information we're getting tells us that they don't, where it's Black people who are being killed by police or much more likely to be killed by police, where we see these videos that you shared of microaggressions. And so if all of society in an undercurrent or an overt way is telling us that Black lives don't matter, we have to explicitly say that they do matter. And those are the people that need defending and protecting and people standing up for them in America today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, and I would ask the question, if at what point in time did Black Lives Matter? Giving the historic specificities of, throughout time of what has happened with Black people in America, at what point did the life matter? Because if it did, then there wouldn't be a need to say Black Lives Matter. And it's not invalidating anyone else's life. Just the same way, when we say save the whales. Okay, we're not saying don't save goldfish. We're not saying don't save sharks. We're just putting emphasis on whales because whales are the ones who are in danger. Okay, the stats going back to the previous screen, the number of people who are shot and killed, who are people of color, their lives are endangered. So that's why there's a need to promote that their life matters, because day-to-day activities don't suggest that they do. So what's the effect of stress and trauma? These experiences that the gentleman felt, the young lady who felt, she said she felt powerless, people on the receiving end of the aggression, what happens? Stress and trauma start to build up. And what happens is that people on the receiving end of microaggressions and racism have to adapt. Right? You can't just fall apart. You can't just lay down and die. You have to adapt. And so there's adaptive coping strategies that develop. But what happens is constantly having to adapt and constantly having to cope becomes exhausting. All right? It becomes exhausting, and the exhaustion from the adaptive coping is what leads to the stress and the trauma. So race-related triggers for stress and trauma, if we look at sociocultural situations that trigger it. The workplace is very stressful and can be traumatic for people of color, as we saw with the young lady in the video. Applying for a job as a person of color can be stressful and can be traumatic, especially when you're rejected from the job based on your name. Famous studies came out of University of Pennsylvania back in the 90s. Does anyone remember or heard about the resume study that was done, where they took the same exact resume and they changed names? They had what is stereotypically a Black sounding name on the resume and a typically American sounding name on the resume, and sent it out. And guess what the outcome was? The resumes that had Black sounding names got less callbacks for interviews than those with the American names, despite the same exact experience, despite everything being the same. The only thing they changed was the name on the resume. Okay, so that for people of color seeking jobs, these acts of racism in the workplace. I mean, I don't know if it still happens in a lot of places, but for years, applications, when you went in person to apply for a job, applications were coded. You know, the receptionist would code the application. It was a Black person, white person applying, and that was used as criteria to give someone an interview. In retail settings, right? The now famous Starbucks incident that happened a couple of years ago down on 18th and Chestnut, where those Black men were arrested for sitting in the Starbucks. Service in stores, being followed in stores. Can you think of any other scenarios in social or cultural situations that could be triggers for stress or trauma?
Marquita writes in the chat box, you see it in healthcare.
Can you give an example or speak on it a little more for everyone else who's not in healthcare?
Samantha, Marquita, I'm gonna call on you.
Yeah, I can say that I've seen it with my mother and sister who have health issues and are always trying to advocate for themselves with their doctors, but aren't always believed. And it's led to some serious health issues for my sister. And we're still battling a lot of that with her because she wasn't believed in the first place when she said she had pain. So.
Yeah. When you started talking, the first thing I thought about is pain. There's a lot of research being done now around chronic pain in terms of how patients are treated differently when it comes to treating pain based on race. So that certainly is something that is being looked into because that's real. Whites who report chronic pain are treated much differently from Blacks who report that are in chronic pain by way of diagnosis, by way of prescription medications, pain medications, etc.
Other examples we have in the chat box are, you see it on the bus. Another person wrote Obama when questioned about his birth certificate.
Birtherism, yep.
We have racist Halloween costumes. Kendo, I see your hand is raised. I'm gonna call on you.
Yeah, I wanted to just add sports and accessibility to sports.
Can you give an example of that?
Okay, so I'm a basketball coach by trade, but my son played football in the beginning. So what I noticed, like early on during the pee-wee sessions, right, when kids are smaller, you know, the parents, you know, the crowd is close to the field. So as those children progress and the better they get at sports, it's like the further they're moved away between parent and coach. So it's like a different culture takes over that process. Once that kid starts showing some I don't want to say greatness in the beginning, but showing some potential. So as that kid starts showing like McDonald All-American potential, top 100 potential, the people that are allowed around that kid, they no longer look like the people that started the kid off. And it's like, all right, we know better than what you know. But in the beginning, it's parents, uncles, his fathers, his brothers, his cousins, all these people push these kids to keep working on their games and get better. But as the kid gets better, and even with the fact that you're in position to offer the kid a scholarship to a school that they couldn't afford previously. So like a private school could be $30,000, $40,000 a year. You don't even look at that child. But if that child is 6'5" in the 7th grade, Now, all these schools and accessibility is granted, but that is, we'll take it from here. That's basically what I'm saying. It's like, we'll take it from here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like what you're saying, that as the stakes get higher, okay, who has the power starts to change.
Exactly. And the conversations start to change as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
So like I said, and I just wanted to add, like I said in the beginning, you're close to the field. I related to, you're close to the field, you're on the field. But as that child progresses, now you're in the stands.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're a little further back. And it's like, even when you want to come and talk to the coach, or you want to talk to administration, they like, we got this from here.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't even want to listen to your input, even though you were part of the basic pillar to get this child started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Chronic examples of stress, chronic meaning that it's pervasive, it's experienced in daily activities, things that you hear the common driving while black. So, daily activities, just simply driving, barbecuing, working on your own house. The incident that happened up in New York in Central Park, where the man was bird watching in Central Park, and the woman they got into a confrontation. She called the police on him. The first incident video, going home to your apartment. Just the daily activities of simply living can be stressful and traumatic. Vicarious stress and trauma, sustained exposure, repeatedly seeing it. So the image that I showed, the third one of the police officer on George Floyd's neck, right? The repeated viewing of that image, watching the news repeatedly, you can end up getting vicarious trauma and stress. I've had clients that I've worked with who, the treatment really was, they had to stop watching the news because they became so traumatized from watching the news. I've seen instances of people from vicarious trauma developing symptoms of PTSD from simply watching the news too much. Ambiguous triggers for stress and trauma. So this is ambiguous because people of color walk around. It's like, okay, when is this incident going to happen to me? I know after the Starbucks incident happened with those gentlemen at Chestnut, I was very, for lack of a better word, paranoid about going into a Starbucks, feeling that if I went into a Starbucks, that the police could end up getting called on me if I sat there too long. Second guessing where you should even go. Should I go into Starbucks? Should I go into that restaurant? Should I go into that neighborhood? Just came to mind the movie The Green Book. If anyone saw that movie, that sums up that sense of ambiguity. Even though that's historical back in the 60s, the legacy of that still is with us, right? Traveling and having to decide while traveling or making arrangements to go someplace, which direction you should go to avoid hostility and to avoid something that may happen to you simply because of the color of your skin. And so Blacks experience significant amounts of stress triggered by encounters with racist individuals, institutions, and the cultural dominance of white supremacy on a daily basis. This happens. So what we see, the effect on chronic illness and the trauma and stress that comes from racism can trigger a descent into chronic illness. So the chronic experiences of race and racism can trigger symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that cannot be explained by an exposure to a specific trauma or life event, which is typical for PTSD. Something happens and it triggers. We see symptoms in people where there was no particular event. And so this then escalates to being in a constant state of hypervigilance, constantly being on guard, constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly being anxious. And what happens is the adaptive coping responses that are needed to deal with this become exhausted, as I mentioned earlier. And what happens physiologically is this leads to elevated cortisol, chronic elevated cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that gets emitted into the bloodstream from stress, and it naturally leaves the bloodstream. But what happens is if it stays elevated in the bloodstream for long periods of time, that's what triggers chronic illness, hypertension, diabetes. And oftentimes maladaptive coping behaviors start to develop. By maladaptive, these are behaviors that, you know, kind of help relax us, but at the end of the day, the outcomes can be negative. So for example, smoking is a maladaptive coping behavior. Drinking, binge eating, these are all behaviors that help us cope and feel better, but they're maladaptive because they can have harm on the back end. And these are the things that we typically see from the biological impact of racial trauma. Working in primary care can tell you these become very common. Chronic fatigue, headaches, sleep disorders is a big one. And we're seeing a lot of reports of that now, you know, during COVID. Right now, the stress from having to cope and adapt to COVID has affected people's sleep disorders. Everyone's sleep is having difficulty sleeping, a sense of a loss of time, unexplained chronic pain. So in the absence of an image, in the absence of an MRI, or the absence of something in an X-ray, somebody still has chronic pain. And so the psychosomatic effects of that, you know, upper back pain, lower back pain, but with an MRI or an X-ray, there's nothing to explain why the person would have chronic pain, but the pain is real. Feel free to jump in with questions or comments if you have any at this point.
We do have a raised hand for Michelle.
Sure.
Hi, I was going to say, I was on a call once earlier this month, and they talked about post-traumatic stress.
Mm-hmm.
And what they said is, we're not, as African Americans or people of color, we're not just dealing with but perpetual stress disorder, because it's
Chronic.
one thing after another, one thing after another. And so instead of saying post-traumatic stress, it's perpetual stress disorder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the important thing to remember here is this can't be explained away by genetics necessarily, because, for example, if we take hypertension, if we look at hypertension rates in African Americans and look at hypertension rates in Africans, there is a big difference. Africans do not have the same level of hypertension that African Americans have, because the environments and contexts and cultures that Africans live in do not have a lot of microaggressions and racism directed at them. The deaths from COVID. One of the things that was announced early on is that people of color suffer from, have higher death rates from COVID than whites do. That's not because of a genetic predisposition that causes COVID to kill people of color off any easier than it does from whites, but it's the health disparities that exist in our healthcare system where people of color are less likely to get the care needed to manage COVID. That's what causes the death, not the genetic predisposition. We see it a lot in mental health, for example, with mental health diagnoses. There's a large body of literature showing the differences in diagnoses, that given the same set of symptoms that get presented, Black people will get diagnosed with schizophrenia more frequently than whites with the same exact symptoms. Whites will get diagnosed with major depressive disorder and Blacks will get diagnosed with schizophrenia with the same exact symptoms.
Dr. Johnson, we have a raised hand
Yes.
from Jeanette.
Hi,
Go
Jeanette.
ahead, Jeanette. You might have to unmute yourself. There we go. Oh. Okay, Jeanette raised her hand or lowered their hand. We do have a couple comments in the box though. We have from Martha, I am going through that pain now from a past car accident, but the doctors don't understand why. And then we have another comment from Samantha, the treatment recommendations also differ by race. Yep.
Yes.
Jeanette, I see your hand raised up again. Did you want to speak again?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Okay, yeah, I feel as though it seems like, so we go through a process of adapting and kind of coping with, you know, chucking it to people's ignorance or not knowing, and then getting to a point where you're exhausted, right? Having to explain or having to try to justify why people act or say dumb things. And then it gets to a point where you're like, okay, enough is enough. You kind of have like a reactive response. And then all of a sudden now you are, you know, aggressive, or you're, you know, it's almost like people not taking a look at what got you to that point of like saying enough is enough, and calling people on it. And, you know, all of a sudden you're, you know, so aggressive, and you know, you have attitude, or, and so it's kind of, you're suppressing, you're coping with it, you're, you know, you're exhausted about it. And then when you talk, you know, like when you try to make your voice heard, it's almost like, oh, you're blowing things out of proportion, or that's not what I meant, you know. And it's exhausting and frustrating. And you know, your lack of your tolerance level just, and I think, you know, it's unfortunate about, you know, what happened to Mr. Floyd, but you know, to get to the extent of somebody having to losing their lives for all of a sudden people, you know, when that happened, we had, you know, white colleagues call us to say, oh my gosh, you know, like, I just want to check in, like, have I ever offended you? Or, well, yeah, you know, and, you know, I just feel like it's, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Like, if you don't call them on it when it happens, you know, you're kind of continuing it with it. And then when you do have an explosive moment, then it's like, oh my gosh, you know, and I'm not sure if I'm getting my point across, but I just feel like
No, you are.
I'm like up to here, and then, you know, when I lash back, it's like, you know, then I'm the bad person because, oh, you know, you're blowing this out of proportion.
And the person who responds with you're blowing it out of proportion, that's the privilege that they have because they've never experienced it.
Right.
They've never been on the receiving end of it. So from their perspective, you're blowing it out of proportion. So even the statement itself shows a lack of empathy. Right. And I mean, and this is common. I mean, you know, and this is not necessarily just, you know, whites, but among a whole bunch of people, Black folks, people of color. You know, emotional intelligence is not as common as people think it is. You know, it's a buzzword that gets thrown around. There's a whole lot of people that we come in contact with on a daily basis that lack emotional intelligence. Right. And that type of response reflects a lack of emotional intelligence. Because even if you don't agree with what the person is saying, even if you can't relate to the person is saying, you can at least be empathetic to what the person is saying. And dismissing and being dismissive as simply blowing it out of proportion reflects a lack of emotional intelligence. Any more hands up, Quinn, in the chat or comments?
No hands. We have one comment, two comments. Kendall writes, can a racist person experience racism?
Can a racist person? Well, I would say yes. If the element of power, if someone is inflicting harm on them in some way based on based on their race, then yeah. But again, the key is the infliction of harm and power.
Right. We have another comment in the chat saying from Jasmine, it's triggering and uncomfortable when someone who is not Black uses any form of the N-word, even by example for something. I get thrown off and I'm not sure how to address it.
You know, and this ties in, I think, to what Jeanette was saying. Addressing these things, you know, when these incidents happen, we have the option, right? You can either not address it, but then not addressing it does what? What does that do for you to not address it? And then if you do address it, you have to be prepared to deal with the consequences that could happen as a result of addressing it. And so it's going to be different for different people, depending on, you know, whether or not you're willing to have to deal with the consequences that could come with addressing it, or if you find some other coping mechanism within yourself to not address it. And that's the tough thing. Being on the receiving end, being powerless, you know, puts you in a precarious position in terms of how to even cope with it.
Okay. We have another comment in the box, and then I'm going to call on Savannah with her hand raised. Martha writes, being a business owner and owning property makes me a drug dealing to others.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Makes me a what?
I think there might have been a typo. I'm not quite sure. Being a business owner and dealer. Okay. Being a business owner and owning property makes me a drug dealer to others.
I don't understand. Can
Martha,
that be clarified? Martha, can you clarify that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Being a business owner and owning properties, people have said she must be a drug dealer for her to
She must be a drug dealer. Yeah.
Properties and have her own business.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, I could have worked hard and saved my money and you know, went to school and got, you know, education and got these things, but that they look at it as me being a drug dealer. That's what I was told when I first came into a mixed neighborhood.
Yeah, I remember years ago I had a white Accord, and I remember several people asking me if I was a drug dealer.
That's terrible.
Thank you for
well, again, the implicit bias, the implicit bias is that you're not supposed to have a nice car, you're not supposed to have property, and so if you do, then it must be something. That's the bias.
Thank you for sharing that, Martha.
Thank you.
I'm gonna call on Savannah. Go ahead, Savannah.
What really struck me when you're talking about power is in those three scenarios you showed. In scenario 2, it's an employer, which is a really clear example of power. In scenario 3, it's a police officer, which is another. Everyone would associate police officers with having power over people. But in scenario 1, it's just two people who live in the same apartment building. And without an understanding of racism, you wouldn't naturally think that one of those people has power over the other. But she did have power over him just because she was white. And I think that's really sitting with me, that when we think of power, it's not just these traditional institutions or easy things that come up. It's just the fact that you are white means that you have power in basically any situation.
Mhm. What struck me about that first, even apart from just the race issue, what struck me about that first scenario was that she kind of made herself the gatekeeper and was just, she was fearless. She had no fear with confronting this man, and felt that it was in her right, and that she was the gatekeeper of this apartment building, of this property, and of determining or assessing who lives here and who doesn't. Without even being an institution, she almost saw herself as an institution. You know what I mean?
I unmuted her. Sorry,
Okay.
Doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, muted.
Okay, so we just talked about the biological impact, the physical impact, but let's talk about the psychological and behavioral impact of racial trauma. So people on the receiving end, again, present with symptoms of irritability, poor decision-making, anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation. That's a big one, right? Presenting as just being in a bad attitude and having a bad attitude, and just being upset. Risk-taking behavior, low self-esteem, and then it gets internalized, where the self-perception becomes biased. There's a lower expectation for achievement and social skills, the normalizing of maladaptive behaviors, low belief in the ability to learn. So we see this a lot with children and young adults. This biased self-perception that they have of themselves as a result of ongoing stress and racial trauma. Okay. So let's talk about diversity, and thinking back to the video, and talking about what we do in the workplace, what we do at our agencies and organizations around diversity. And I argue that most diversity programs are disingenuous. They're disingenuous, and they actually end up reinforcing racism and not alleviating it. Because diversity, and anthropologists have found this in their studies of diversity in the workplace. Diversity is only acceptable in certain domains. And I argue the 3 Fs. We're fine with diversity when it comes to food, fabrics, and festivals. So different types of clothing, the annual ethnic festival down on Penn's Landing, different foods that people may bring in, or go into different restaurants. We're very comfortable. That's an acceptable domain. And we're very comfortable with diversity in professions that are feminized. So in female dominant professions, when there's diversity, we're very comfortable with that. Okay, but we're not comfortable with diversity in domains, when I say are unacceptable, in top levels of leadership and in professions that are male dominant. We're not we're not comfortable with having diversity in those domains. And it reinforces racism, because basically what you're saying is the person's full stuff. I'm okay with you. I'm comfortable with you, okay, as long as it sticks to food, fabrics, and festivals. Once you step out of that in your diversity, okay, I'm now uncomfortable. Okay, so your full self is not enough. You have to be restricted, okay, to just certain domains around diversity. Has anyone experienced this in their organization or agency, or seen this or witnessed this in their own life?
Show a raise of hands. Hit your raise hand button if you have. 1, 2, 3. Okay. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Wow.
Okay.
Anyone want to give share an example?
Where'd those 8 hands just go? Okay, thank you, Calvin. I'm gonna call on you. Oh wait, Calvin, do you want to share an example?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I worked in corporate America for a number of years. And when I started my own business, one of my colleagues asked me to renovate their home. And when we went to renovate, I had my employees working in her home, and she called me and she said, I need to talk to you. One of your guys said something to me, and she said she felt uncomfortable. I went to speak to her about it to understand what the issue was, and I realized that she was on the black male, and I realized that she liked me as Calvin. She got to know me at work, but she had a problem with African Americans overall. And it was my first time realizing that you can like me as an individual, but have a problem with my race overall. And really, it made me step back and evaluate our friendship.
I think something happened to Calvin.
I think so too.
Okay.
Doctor, just a reminder, we are at 10:07, and I'm getting.
Sure. I think I have one more slide to wrap this up.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up at 10:15.
Okay. Did anyone else want to share anything related to this? So this is the point of this is to get you to think. If we value diversity, if we're sincere in valuing diversity, and we want to have diversity in the workplace, and we want to have it at our agencies and organizations, and we're leaders in our organization, okay, how sincere are we with this? And that's the food for thought. Moving forward, to reflect on your own commitment to anti-racism and diversity. And that it has to start with the self. How much diversity exists in your own personal life? You can't, if you don't have diversity in your own personal life, okay, then how committed are you to diversity in the workplace, in the community, in society, when it doesn't even happen in your own personal life? Assess beyond the front end of the diversity continuum. So the diversity continuum, it starts with the hiring, right? There's this checkbox of this category. This person's a woman, this person is Latina, this person is Asian, this person is LGBTQ. So we have these categories that we check off. And, for many places, it's like, oh, well, we have diversity, we have these employees. Okay. But true diversity in the workplace also has to address inclusivity and equity. How inclusive and equitable is your organization? These same checkbox folks that you hired, are any of them sitting at the table when it comes to making decisions, when it comes to strategizing, when it comes to leading? Are they at the table? Where do they fall after you hire them? Where do they fall in the organization? If you're committed to inclusivity and equity in your organization, what's the plan to evaluate the efficacy of the diversity program? So you say that you're inclusive and you have equity. How are you evaluating it? How do you know it's working? It has to be more than just a body walking around the building, a body in the meeting room, a body sitting sitting on the call. How are you evaluating the efficacy of the program? And then finally, I would say, to close with this, is the stress attached to organizational and societal change. This is normal. This is new for most of us. We're navigating through areas of this. Here in 2020 has forced us to navigate and start considering and thinking about things that we have not been comfortable with doing. Okay, it's painful. it's stressful. And in the middle of all of it, you still have to take care of yourself, because if you don't engage in self-care and make that a priority, then you're not going to be able to do all the other things that we need to do in order to bring about diversity and equity in our society and community. And let's close with that thought. Any comments?
Comments?
Jeanette wrote, as a small business, sometimes people don't want to work with us because we are Black and Puerto Rican owned company. They prefer to work with privilege.
Yeah. But I'm sure there are companies out there that would work with you. It's just it's a matter, the challenge is in identifying them.
Jeanette,
Let me just say, I've got an alarm going off in my building in case you hear something in the background. But I just want to say something that has been consistent, a theme that has been consistent both in webinar number 1 and today's, is that the stress of racism has a real biological impact on people that manifests itself in a physical way. So we tend to think of stress as high blood pressure, but as we saw in this presentation, there are any number of physical manifestations that you may not even attribute to the stress of racism that is making its way through your body and causing, in some instances, eventually a mortality rate that is higher with Black people than it is with other races. So on today, we really thank Dr. Johnson. It's a test. We apologize. It's a test. It's not an actual fire. So there is a theme. So as we talk about this series, is it just me? No, it's not just you. It's real. And so as we continue with this series, we are going to touch on other subjects. If you have additional questions, comments, discussion that you want to hear from today's presentation, we are prepared to work with Dr. Johnson to come back to do a part 2 from today's webinar. Just let us know in the chat. You can send us an email. But part 3 of this series is going to be on Tuesday, December 15th. And in that webinar, we are going to talk about the stress of distance virtual learning as it relates to the business owner who is the parent. And then January, February, March, we're going to continue the third Tuesday of each month with this series. We are sincerely appreciative to Dr. Johnson, to our partners, Scattergood Foundation and Spectrum Health Services, for working with us on this series. I think there was something in the chat. I will put my email address in the chat for those who want to have Dr. Johnson come back and go into more depth for this topic. We know it is a topic that you cannot cover in 1 hour, but we want to make sure that you have the space to hear the information concerning how you feel, and really it validates what you're feeling and what you're thinking and what you're going through and what your body is telling you, what your mind is telling you. This is to validate those things because they are real. So I will put my email address in the chat. If you would like us to bring back Dr. Johnson to talk more about this topic, to give you again that safe space to make your comments, ask your questions, I just put my email address in the chat. Feel free to send me your comments. And with that, I think, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much. I know Samantha's on this line from Scattergood. We could not do this without bringing in the behavioral health professionals who have extensive experience in addressing these very, very difficult topics. So, Dr. Johnson, any parting words for our participants?
Self-care in the age 2020 is challenging us in ways that none of us could have imagined. And we've got to take care of ourselves and each other.
Great. Samantha, any parting words? Samantha says she can't speak right now, but thank you. She's
okay. Now I can. I just wanted to say thank you. I think that was, you know, a really real tough way to start, in a good way to start our day. And I just want to thank you again for the conversation and for everyone's participation in it.
And Dr. Johnson has listed his personal email address. We will also make his information available to you for anyone who needs to follow up. Personally, he does have a practice. And so if you would like to get in contact with Dr. Johnson, we will make all of that information available. The important thing is to know you are not alone. You are not alone. And we don't like to think of mental health issues, but it's a reality. Whether it's depression, it's a reality. Whether it's manifesting itself in some other physical kind of way, it's a reality. And so just know that you are not alone and that help is available. So with that, we thank you and we look forward to seeing you on the third Tuesday in December for part 3. And before then, for all of the business owners on the call, we are having on Tuesday, December 8th, webinar on financial strategies, avoiding pitfalls and understanding metrics to accelerating growth. Make sure you go to the PIDC website, register. All of our webinars are free. So we especially thank our presenters for giving of their time and their expertise to get that information, that vital information out to you in the business community. So with that, have a great day. We look forward to seeing you soon.